If America does not abolish the Federal Reserve will abolish America.
This video is brought to you by Reluctant Preppers. Click here to subscribe for free to reluctantpreppers.com. Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with Finance.nl, and back with us today is G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island and an all-around expert on the Federal Reserve. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Griffin. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Elijah. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Well, today is the Federal Reserve's 100th anniversary, and I really wanted to have you on today to discuss the Federal Reserve. Let's start out by examining how the Federal Reserve has affected our country over the past 100 years. How do you see are some of maybe the main ways in which the Federal Reserve has impacted our country in the past 100 years?
Well, that's an interesting question, Elijah. I think the Federal Reserve is the machine that creates money for the United States. We can come back to that later if you wish as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that a private institution, which the Federal Reserve is, it's basically a cartel. Whether it's a good idea for a cartel or anyone else to have a monopoly over a nation's money supply. But the fact is that they do. And over the years, they have created so much money, they've expanded the money supply because it's profitable to them to do so. You can imagine if you had the power to create money, you might be tempted to create more and more of it, as they are. And so consequently, the supply of money in the United States and indirectly around the world, because the United States still is the economic leader of the world, has just been expanding at an incredible rate, especially since 2008. And when the expansion of the money supply expands at a rate greater than the expansion of goods and services that the money is used to purchase, we have that classic phenomenon called inflation. And so the end of all of this thought process is that ever since the Federal Reserve System was created back in 1913, we've had basically an inflation-creating machine. And in the beginning, it wasn't too noticeable because the system was just getting ramped up. It was, testing the systems. It was experimenting with this and that. And but of late, of course, the machine is running full bore. And so we've seen a very marked decline in purchasing power for the average person. In terms of 1913 dollars, the dollar's value today is worth about 2 or 3 cents. That means that the purchasing power of the dollar in the last 100 years has eroded or been confiscated, if you will, by the system, 97 or 98%. 97 or 98% of all of the money that people have earned and saved as their retirement or to pass on to their children or whatever they want to do with their money. It's all been taken in a very mysterious way to the average person, very esoteric way. And so what we have now is a huge machine that's just running full bore and continuing this process to the point where it's not just taking our personal savings and we have no control over it, but it's also bankrupting the nation. It's the nation now is come pretty much to the end of the game. It can't go on much longer. How much longer is always the question. I don't really know. I'm amazed it's gone on this long, but I do know it can't go on forever. This process is like, if I may make an analogy, like Spanish moss gradually eating away at one of those beautiful oak trees. I've got some on our property, and I look at these beautiful oak trees, and they're gorgeous. And then down the hill, I see some older ones, and the moss has been eating away at the tree for quite a few years, and now the tree is dying. And I look further down the hill, and I see the dead remnants of once beautiful oak trees. They're completely dead, and now the moss that killed those trees is dead also. And And I think it's a good analogy because the Federal Reserve System is like this moss. It's a parasite. And in the beginning, the oak tree, or in our case, the economy, is strong enough to feed the parasite. It's okay. I mean, it's a big, powerful oak tree, big, powerful economy. And the parasite grows and grows and grows until finally there's a tipping point, which was passed in our case a long time ago. And from that point, it's all downhill. And you see that the tree is in decline. It's in its final death stages. You could argue that, well, it was going to die anyway, and that's true. But we know that if the moss, if the parasites don't get to the tree will live much, much longer than if it has to sustain this life-sucking force, this parasite. So I think maybe I took too long on that analogy, but I think that's what we've got, 100 years of a parasite drawing the lifeblood out of the economy of the United States. And I think we have been in decline. I think anybody can see that. And now we have a very serious problem of maybe the economy is going to finally reach its fatal termination, possibly even in my lifetime.
Right. I mean, a lot of people are talking that, the economy is in a really bad situation, and it seems like we could be headed towards a complete economic collapse for our country like we've never seen before. I wanted to get back on what you were talking about, the effect on the average person. You were speaking about how it has really caused a lot of inflation for people. But some may argue that before the Federal Reserve was created, the monetary system was much more unstable, and that it's really been worth it because we've had a lot of economic growth, maybe not in the last couple of years, but throughout the 20th century, we've had a lot of economic growth since the Federal Reserve has been implemented, and we've had a somewhat stable economy, and people would argue that it's been more stable since the Federal Reserve was created. Do you agree with that? And if so, has it been worth it?
Well, I definitely do not agree with that, although I can see why some people might come to that conclusion if they want to just look at the surface and pick what surfaces they look at. I would love to really debate anybody that wants to argue that point. I think we could not have too much difficulty finding all of the evidence, all the statistics, all the historical record that we need to prove that that is not a correct analysis. What we really see, in my view at least, is that, yes, it's true, prior to the formation of the Federal Reserve, the banking system in the United States certainly was under great stress. It wasn't what you call the epitome of honesty and stability. Actually, if you look at it, what was happening was that what we now have as the Federal Reserve System, this thing called a central bank, this partnership between government and private banks, creating money and controlling the money supply and credit and all that sort of thing, that was already in existence prior to the Federal Reserve, but it was operating at a state level. Each of the states was doing its own little thing like that, had its own central bank and playing this game and expanding the money supply and allowing banks certain political and economic privileges. It gave them privileges to participate in what they call fractional reserve banking, which means that they're able to create money out of nothing and lend out money that they don't really have, and promise depositors that everything they put in the bank is on deposit. They call it a deposit, a demand deposit is the phrase they give it, and they let people think that, well, you put the money in with our bank and you can come in and demand it anytime you want, and we'll give it right back to you because we got it in the vault, right? Well, that's a lie. They don't have it in the vault. They not only loaned it out to somebody, but they multiplied what they loaned out. If you put a dollar in the bank, they'll loan out $9 based on your $1. So all of this was authorized. It was legalized by the states, and it was really what caused those little booms and bust cycles prior to the Federal Reserve. And if you look at the records, you'll see that these booms and busts were local. They were focused on certain states. It wasn't clear across the country. If you had a problem in one state, you at least had the freedom to go to another state and do your banking there. It wasn't much better, but at least the timing was different. It wasn't all tied together. Well, when the Federal Reserve System was created, basically what these geniuses did is they said, well, we got a big problem with these boom bust cycles because the bank is creating money out of nothing and creating these bubbles that get burst. And they're doing this in all of these states. We got a great idea. Let's pull it all together. Let's do it all as one single nation. That'll solve the problem. And that's basically what they did. So the solution that the politicians and the bankers offered was merely to pump up the very events and theories that were causing the problem in the first place, and they just made it bigger. Well, you can kick the can down the road a little bit that way, which is what they did, but in doing so, they didn't solve the problem, and they just made it bigger, and they knew that someday these chickens were going to come home to roost, and they're coming home to roost now.
Right, and I know that a lot of the goals of the Federal Reserve, for one, was to stabilize the economy and also to maintain, the stability of the dollar. And as you mentioned, the Federal Reserve has not been successful at that. They haven't been very successful at maintaining a stable economy, and the dollar has lost pretty much, 97% of its value. But what it has been successful at doing is basically protecting the banks at all costs. Currently, the Federal Reserve is creating $75 billion per month. And as a former Federal Reserve official says, this is basically just the biggest backdoor bailout for Wall Street of all time. So the Federal Reserve is not really helping the American people. It's helping the banks.
Well, yes. And of course, you started your statement by saying that the goal of the Federal Reserve was to stabilize the economy. Who says that was the goal of the Federal Reserve? Well, the Federal Reserve says it, right? But that was never its goal. Folks, let's be serious about this. If we understand that the Federal Reserve is a cartel, it's not a government agency. It's not a group of benevolent, patriotic, and spirited citizens who want to help America and protect the. It's a bunch of banks that want to improve their bottom line. It's no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel like OPEC. All cartels have only one goal and one purpose, and that's to benefit the members of the cartel. Period, period, period. So when you hear people say, well, the goal was to stabilize the economy and they didn't do a good job, that's nonsense. The goal has never been to stabilize the economy. The goal has been to protect the banks and, if necessary, to plunder the American people to do so, which they have been doing. And so when you realize what the real goal was to protect the banks and to make as much money as possible. Now you give them an A on their report card. They succeeded immensely. And the whole problem is because we listen to their propaganda and we believe it. The chairman of the Federal Reserve comes on television or he's testifying before a congressional committee of some kind, and he says, well, we raised interest rates today because we want to stabilize the economy. We want to cool down inflation. We're concerned about inflation. Or they say we lowered interest rates because we want to stimulate employment, as though they really cared a dang about employment or inflation. They don't care about any of that stuff, but they know they have to say those things so that the average guy, the gum-chewing public watching it on television says, oh, yeah, he's a good man. He really cares. They're just like politicians. They know what people want to hear, and so they say those phrases. And you can understand why people would do that if they stood to make a bazillion dollars, if they were a criminal mentality. You can understand there are criminals out there. But what I don't understand is why so many Americans fall for it over and over and over again. You'd think that after the 10th or 12th time of being hit in the jaw by somebody, you'd say, maybe this guy is trying to do me in, rather than say, well, he's a good man because he said the right thing.
Right, and I know that we've discussed before, and we don't have enough time to get into this today, but basically, how the Federal Reserve created, it is pretty much created by the banks on Jekyll Island. And so who is really behind the Federal Reserve now? Is it still basically the banks? I mean, who's pulling the strings? Is it Ben Bernanke, or is it still the banks who are really controlling everything about the Federal Reserve?
It's still the banks, of course. It's a cartel. And cartels, remember, are really basically unions, trade unions for their industry. They come together and decided, well, we're all friendly competitors. We're all in the same business together. But if we come together and form a cartel, we can agree in what limited areas we can compete, and we'll agree not to compete in certain big areas so that we won't be at each other's throats, and we can, enhance our industry and present a unified front to the public and to the consumer, and thereby enhance our profit. And that's all the Federal Reserve ever has been, and all it is now, and all it will ever be. That's the kind of an animal it is. And so it's not going to change. It hasn't changed. And people like Bernanke and Greenspan and all those chairman Volcker and all these chairmen of the Federal Reserve, we get the impression that they're really running everything. No, 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 no. They're employees. They take their orders from the banks. They're selected really, even though the president says, I appoint you, the president makes his appointment from a list of candidates that are submitted to him by the large financial institutions and indirectly through their campaign contributors. It's all backroom stuff. And so the president, when he appoints a chairman of the Federal Reserve, he doesn't even know this guy. He says, "Who is this again?" "Oh, okay, thank you. I appoint you chairman of the Federal Reserve." So doesn't even know these people. So where does he get the list? Well, he gets it from the finance committees in Congress. He gets it from the big donors to the presidential campaigns and all that sort of thing. As I say, it's backroom stuff. So when we look at people like Bernanke making these statements, we should know at least, that this is not his idea. He didn't invent all of this. He is taking orders from the large dominant banks. And just go down to Wall Street and take a look at who the big banks are. Look at the Citibank. Just look at them and Morgan and so forth. These are the forces. You don't even know. You don't hear about the presidents of these banks normally in the news, and the chairman of the boards of these banks, but those are the sources of power, and the chairmen themselves are merely executives carrying out the will of the banks themselves.
So we've had this institution for 100 years. It's been basically stealing from the American people through inflation, basically giving money to the banks, helping the banks out, not helping the American people. What do we do? Do we audit this institution, as Rand Paul, is putting a lot of effort to try to get an audit through? What do we do?
Well, that's really the nuts and bolts of it, isn't it? What do? We who have individually, we have very little, if any, power over these things. Well, nothing is going to change until we abolish the Fed. I mean, as long as it's allowed to exist, it's going to continue doing what it does, because that's the creature that it is. It's a cartel, and it's going to continue to legally plunder the American people. And I'll jump right to the bottom line. I totally believe, that if America does not abolish the Federal Reserve will abolish America as we have known it. And that is about the most succinct way I know how to say this. This is as serious as a heart attack. And people are dealing with it as though it's just, another political issue that we should talk about and debate. No. We have to do something about it. We have to do something very soon. But now, how and what? We have no power. So you back off of what we know we have to do, and you ask the question, well, how do we do that? We have to really make some serious changes in Washington, because most of these congressmen and senators there are really either beholden to this creature, this Federal Reserve System, or they're afraid of it. They know that if they say something or do something that would challenge that power, that it's almost like a political death sentence for them, because their campaign contributions will dry up. Certain segments of the media will start attacking them. They'll be dragged through the court of public opinion. They'll be portrayed as money grubbing or dishonest people or sex offenders or money launderers or whatever. Some of these things are actually true, by the way, but they don't have to be true, because the charges can be made up. Most politicians know you don't touch the Federal Reserve. And whether or not auditing the Fed is a good idea or not, I suppose it is. In my book, I said we don't need to audit the Fed. We need to abolish the Fed. We already know what the Fed is doing. We know it's stealing from the American people. We know it's unconstitutional. We know it's legalized plunder. What do we need to audit the mafia for? We know what the mafia is all about. Let's get on with it, That was my position in the book, and it really still is. But I concede that an audit might have some advantage as a stepping stone toward that final goal, because this last audit that was performed, it was far from complete, But there was a sort of a mini audit made here in the last year. And out of that came the discovery that the Fed was sending billions and billions of U.S. taxpayers' dollars to banks in Europe. Well, we suspected that. A lot of people were talking about that probably happening, but there was no way to prove it. Well, it came out as a result of that audit. And well, this enraged a lot of people that had been pretty complacent previously to that. And so I could see then that maybe an audit is a good idea, but that's certainly not the end of the game. That's just to get more information out to awaken this slumbering giant of American public opinion. And so I'm for an audit, but I don't think that should be the end of it. The audit is a stepping stone to abolishing the Fed, and that will not happen until we change the nameplates on those doors and desktops in Washington, and that means we have to get busy in politics. And there you have it in a summary.
Those are some really interesting points, Mr. Griffin, and it was a pleasure to speak with you. I want to just thank you once again for being here. And I know one way that people can take action is through your freedomforceinternational.org website. Did you want to explain a little bit about that?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, that's really what it's all about. We came to the conclusion a long time ago that just knowing about these things was not enough. Just talking about them is not enough. Not getting all frothed up and excited and angry about it's not enough. We have to get in there and, as I said, change those nameplates, get involved in politics, and not just politics, but across the board. We have to be influential in the media centers and in labor unions and educational institutions and all across the board. We have to sort of take back the system. It's not enough just to get a guy in the White House. We think, who are we going to vote for? As though that was that little simple answer some people think is all we have to do. Who are you going to vote for? Which party are you going to choose? It's much bigger than that. And we knew that this needed to be done. And so we created this organization called Freedom Force International. And we have a strategy for taking back all of these important, influential power centers, as they're called, including political parties. It's got to be done, and all of that. And we know how to do it. And amazingly, the reason we know how to do it is because we saw how the opposition has done it. I mean, these people have taken over not just the United States, but all of the Western countries of the world, and converted it into this collectivist drift that we see, or rush. They didn't do it by invading with armies. They didn't drop bombs on our country or these other countries. They quietly moved into all of these organizations, and took them over at the top. And we know how they did it. It was nonviolent. It was sort of in the background, very quiet, very subtle, and was very brilliant, actually. So we know how to do it, and all we have to do is just sort of go in there and take it back. So anybody that wants to become part of the solution and really make a difference, instead of just complaining about it, I urge you all to come to our website. It's called freedomforceinternational.org. Be prepared to do a lot of reading there. We have nothing to sell, just an idea. We think it's an idea whose time has come, and it's a means of taking back our freedoms. And it's something that's very challenging and very exciting, and we're already on the road. So we welcome you to come and join us. It's freedomforceinternational.org.
All right, and also I know that you have your book. If people are interested to learn a lot more about the Federal Reserve, a lot of history behind the Federal Reserve, I've read it. It's an amazing book. I really recommend it for people. People can pick it up at therealityzone.com. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Thank you.
All right. Once again, G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me, and keep up the good work.
This video was brought to you by ReluctantPreppers.com. Click here to watch Reluctant Prepper's latest interview with Jerry Robinson to learn about the safest place to live and how you can make an income anywhere. Click here to subscribe for free to FinanceandLiberty.com and also our sponsor, ReluctantPreppers.com, helping you be aware and prepared.